right, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Today's presentation is entitled Haunted Lighthouses of New England with Jeremy DeTremont. Jeremy is a really the leading expert on New England's historic lighthouses. He's here to explore some of the macabre tales of New England's coastal beacons, including the lovelorn spirit known as Ernie at Connecticut's New London Ledge Light and the piano-playing ghost at Maine's Sanguine Light. Also included will be accounts of strange happenings at America's oldest light station, Boston Light, and also at Portsmouth Harbur Lighthouse in Newcastle, New Hampshire. Jeremy is the president and historian of the American Lighthouse Foundation, the historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society, and the author of more than 20 books and hundreds of articles on lighthouses and maritime history. He's the producer and host of the U.S. Lighthouse Society's podcast, Lighthearted. Get it? Get it? And he's appeared on the popular Ghost Hunters TV show, as well as Haunted Lighthouses of America on the Travel Channel. So I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for being the primary sponsor for this morning's program. But most importantly, I want to thank all the libraries in the area that helped me promote the program. And those libraries who are here with us this morning include Boxford, Clinton, Dracut, Hudson, Lowell, Northfield, North Reading, Norwood, Raleigh, Stoughton, and West Newbury. So we thank them for their marketing support. So everyone who's watching here live on Zoom and those watching on Facebook and those that will watch later on the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeremy for joining us this morning. And Jeremy, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Robert, for that great introduction. Thank you for having me today. I've spoken in person a couple of times at the library, and it's nice to be doing this one via Zoom. So thank you, everybody, for attending this morning. Sorry, it's not a dark and stormy morning. It's a beautiful morning, but this will have to do. So I'm going to jump right into it here. I'm going to go to share screen, and hopefully you're all seeing my screen at this point. And just a real quick introduction here. I've been doing lighthouse stuff of one kind or another for almost 40 years, since the 1980s. And I fell in love with how lighthouses look. I started taking pictures of them in the 80s, and then I soon found out how fascinating their history is, the human history of lighthouses. And so it's the beauty combined with the human history that's really kept me interested. But ghost stories are a big part of the fabric of a lot of these places. And I think it's no secret at all. Seems like everywhere I go, people love lighthouses. They certainly have wide appeal, and they symbolize a lot of positive things for people. I would say lighthouses are probably the most used symbol or icon, positive symbol or icon in our culture. They're used to symbolize guidance and hope and faith and steadfastness, just all kinds of positive qualities. And of course, lighthouses were built for nothing but good reasons, to save life and property. So it's appropriate that they're used as such a positive icon. But, excuse me, I'd like to say that lighthouses also have a dark side. There's maybe a little bit of a pun intended there. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm just looking at a message that popped up there on my screen, but it's now gone away. So lighthouses, as I say, also have kind of a dark side. There seems to be something about that mysterious light out in the darkness, that I would say sparks our imaginations. At least it does mine. You see a light out there flashing in the darkness, maybe out on a rock or a small island somewhere, and you wonder what was it like to be a keeper at a place like that. And no matter how you look at it, whether you believe in these ghost stories or not, excuse me, it was a scary existence, living at a lighthouse like that, an isolated lighthouse all year round through the winter. Certainly it was a dangerous job in many ways. And if you research the history of most offshore lighthouses, you're going to find probably some tragedies in there somewhere. So it was a scary way of life in many ways. I have no doubt that some of these stories, some of the ones I'll tell you about today, and some of the stories, if you if you Google lighthouse ghost stories, you'll find all kinds of stories. Some of these stories can definitely be chalked up to imagination. You know, if you were a lighthouse keeper, or maybe a family member of a lighthouse keeper living at these places, especially the really isolated lighthouses out in the ocean, you could hear strange sounds, sometimes maybe animal sounds. I've heard about people on the West Coast where there's lots of sea lions. Those sea lions can make some pretty strange sounds. You might, you know, read things into it when you hear a weird cry from a seal or sea lion in the middle of the night. And, you know, some of these lighthouses are cast iron, so they expand and contract in the cold, and that can make strange noises. The wind in a lighthouse can make strange noises. So, and your eyes may play tricks on you, especially if you're at a lighthouse for weeks or months without being able to leave, you know. I have no doubt that some of these stories can be chalked up to imagination. Also, as stories are passed down, as we all know, from generation to generation or from person to person, they can be exaggerated. The internet is a great means for exaggerating stories. So I have no doubt that imagination and exaggeration plays a part in some of these stories. But I will also tell you that I've had some personal experiences that I'll tell you a bit about today. And I've been told firsthand some of these stories, and I don't think the people have told me some of these things are crazy. To the best of my knowledge, they're not crazy. They weren't drunk when these things happened. So I like to call myself an open-minded skeptic. You know, I think it's healthy to be skeptical. I also think it's healthy to be open-minded. I'll just mention that over the years, I've talked to lighthouse keepers. I've interviewed quite a few lighthouse keepers for my work. And a couple of times they'll just, I won't ask for it, but they'll tell me weird sort of paranormal type things that they've experienced. Like one guy had been a lighthouse keeper in Maine. I thought we were about to hang up the phone call, and he said, started laughing, and he said, you know, some people think there are ghosts at the lighthouses. So I thought, okay, he doesn't believe in that. But he said he was at this lighthouse way up the Maine coast. And one night he was out on the island. He looked over at the lighthouse and he saw a woman sitting on the railing at the top of the tower. And that was really odd because there was no woman on the island. And, you know, you wouldn't want to sit on that railing. He said her legs were dangling over the side of the lighthouse. And he was absolutely sure of what he saw. So he said something like, well, so maybe there are ghosts at the lighthouse, because that's what he saw. So, you know, I've been told so many of these things firsthand by people. And the dark side of lighthouses is certainly something that has appealed to many writers and filmmakers over the years. Here are some covers of books. These aren't necessarily ghost stories. You know, lighthouses have been employed in all kinds of horror and science fiction stories. The upper left, The Foghorn, was a classic story by the science fiction writer Ray Bradbury, and it was adapted into the movie The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms in the 1950s, which has a great scene of the sea monster attacking the lighthouse. I love that scene. Stephen King, our most popular writer of horror fiction, his book and the miniseries that was based on it, Storm of the Century, featured a lighthouse very prominently. So lighthouses definitely have their mysterious side that lends itself to these kinds of stories. And it's not that well known, but our most famous horror writer in American history, Edgar Allan Poe, was writing a story about a lighthouse when he died. He left behind fragmentary notes in his notebook. And this is, you see some of the text of the story there. He was writing about a lighthouse keeper off the coast of England in the late 1700s. And the idea was that this man wanted the isolation of being a lighthouse keeper. But as time went on, he started to lose his mind, basically. And weird things are happening. He sees figures or, you know, mysterious creatures. And it's not clear what Poe had in mind, where he was going to take the story, because he didn't come close to finishing it. But an editor, Christopher Conlon, enlisted the help of a bunch of science fiction and horror writers from around the country and put together this book, Poe's Lighthouse, about maybe at least 15 years ago. It's fun to read how these different writers kind of took Poe's notes and used them as the basis to build the story around. If you find, it's out of print now, I recommend it, but if you find a used copy, I just want to warn you that a couple of the chapters are kind of adult in nature, so consider yourself warned, but it's a very interesting book. All right, so I'm going to start my lighthouse ghost stories today with Boston Light. Boston Light is the oldest lighthouse on the North American continent, the oldest light station, I should say. And it was established in 1716 on a little island called Little Brewster Island in outer Boston Harbor. The merchants of Boston petitioned for a lighthouse because Boston was already a very busy harbor by the early 1700s. And they got their wish. So a local man was hired to be the very first lighthouse keeper on the North American continent. His name was George Worthylake. He was a 43-year-old man who had a farm on one of the other harbor islands. Worthylake and his wife and 2 daughters went to live on the island. Along with them was a family servant and 2 slaves. There were slaves at some of the early colonial lighthouses. Unfortunately, we know very, very little about them, really basically nothing about them. So the 2 slaves of Boston Light were a male slave named Shadwell and a female slave named Dinah. So George Worthylake was paid next to nothing by the colony, by Massachusetts. He had to do extra things to make a living. He served as a harbor pilot, helping incoming vessels. He tried having a flock of sheep for a while, which didn't work out very well because his flock of 59 sheep wandered out on a sand spit at low tide. And sadly, the tide came in and that was the end of his flock of sheep. So he had pretty miserable luck. In November of 1718, Worthylake went into Boston on a Sunday with his wife and one of their 2 daughters and the family servant, not the slave, but the family servant. So they went into Boston, attended church on Sunday, stayed overnight. On Monday morning, they were traveling back to the lighthouse in a sloop, probably similar to the drawing you see here. They picked up a family friend at Lovell's Island, where Worthylake had his farm. They anchored off of Boston Light. Shadwell, the slave, paddled a canoe out to meet the landing party. 6 people crowded into this canoe. There was not a storm or anything going on, not especially big waves or anything. But as they were in this canoe going back to the island, the Worthylake's other daughter and a friend were watching from the island, and the canoe capsized, and all 6 of those people drowned. And this is still, in terms of loss of life, this is the worst lighthouse tragedy in American history. This is the triple gravestone of George, Ann, and Ruth Worthylake. It's in the Cops Hill Burying Ground in Boston's North End. And it's got those spooky old death's heads they would put on the gravestones at that time. Kind of shows the stark view of life and death they had. And a couple of interesting side notes. The stonecutter who carved this gravestone subsequently married the Worthylake's surviving daughter, so something good came out of it, I guess. Cotton Mather, the famous minister, preached a sermon about this, and Benjamin Franklin, who was 12 years old at the time, wrote a poem called The Lighthouse Tragedy and sold copies on the streets of Boston. So it was obviously big front page news of its day. And also the second keeper who went out to Boston Light to replace Worthylake, Robert Saunders, also drowned a few days after taking the job. So people wondered if the island was cursed in some way. So I'm going to jump ahead to around 1950. I should mention lighthouse keepers were civilian employees of the federal government for much of our history, but then in 1939, the Coast Guard took over the management of lighthouses, and the Coast Guard still manages the navigational lights today, although the lighthouse structures themselves are largely being taken care of by nonprofit organizations, sometimes town or city governments, sometimes national or state parks, et cetera. But the Coast Guard still manages the lights. So around 1950, there was a Coast Guard lightkeeper at Boston Light named Russell Anderson. And he had a wife, Maisie Freeman Anderson. Maisie Freeman Anderson grew up at lighthouses in Maine, where her father was a keeper, and then she married this Coast Guardsman. So they were living at Boston Light for a couple of years around 1950. And later, Maisie wrote an article for Yankee Magazine about her life at lighthouses. And she said when they were at Boston Light, sometimes she would hear a little girl's voice, like she was sobbing outside. And she thought that was weird because there was no little girl on the island. And sometimes she would hear not just the sobbing, but this little girl's voice would repeat, Shadwell, Shadwell. And Maisie had no idea what that meant. Is that a word, a name, Shadwell? Later, when she was researching the history of Boston Light, she discovered that the slave who was paddling that canoe that capsized and the 6 people drowned, the slave's name was Shadwell. So Maisie felt that what she was hearing was kind of a replay of the event from November 1718, when the 6 people drowned, and that she was hearing the daughter of George Worthylake calling out for help from Shadwell the slave. Do we know that that's really what she heard? No, but she was quite sure about it in the article. She also said that sometimes she would be at the boathouse, and she would hear a man's voice from the boathouse when nobody was there. And sometimes she heard maniacal laughter coming out of the boathouse. And I have no idea what that's about. So I got involved with Boston Light in the late 80s. I was living in Winthrop, Mass at the time, and I was helping to give tours for the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands. So I was out there quite a bit in the late 80s, and I got to know this guy, Dennis Dever, who at that time was the Coast Guard's officer in charge of the lighthouse. And I interviewed Dennis at the top of the lighthouse in the summer of '89. So I'll play you a quick clip of that interview here.
It's a nice environment in the evening when the wind's howling, the snow's flying, and the sea's roaring against the rocks outside your window, just to sit there in the living room, maybe read Edgar Allan Poe book or something like that. That's what I enjoy doing.
Dennis loved being a lighthouse keeper, and he loved a good storm out there. It looked like he was going to be the last lighthouse keeper in America for a while. What happened was basically all the lighthouses in the country were automated by the late 80s. Boston Light was scheduled to be the last lighthouse in the country to be automated in 1990. Once it was automated, they were going to remove the Coast Guard keepers, but people were afraid the place would fall to ruin if there was nobody living there. So legislation was passed in October '89, led by Senator Ted Kennedy, to keep a presence there. So the Coast Guard kept keepers there for a number of years, but then about 18 years ago, they hired a new keeper. And I actually I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. I want to tell you a little bit more about Dennis Dever. He told me some interesting ghost stories. For one thing, he said that he would sometimes be working in the boathouse that you see here, and he would have the radio on while he was working. He would have it on a rock station. And he said the radio would change itself to a classical station. He would change it back to the rock station and so on, back and forth. He had like a running battle with the radio. He and some of the other Coast Guard keepers told me that other weird things would happen. They claimed that tools would disappear, things would rearrange themselves. I think one claimed coffee, hit a cup full of coffee, and then suddenly the coffee was gone and nobody else was there. Things like that, just odd little things. And they would always blame old George, meaning George Worthylake, the first keeper, for these things. One time, Dennis was in the keeper's house looking out a window towards the lighthouse, and he was sure he saw a man at the top of the lighthouse in the lantern room. And he thought that was odd because the only other guy on the island was in the next room. He made sure the guy was right there. So Dennis ran over to the lighthouse, and you could still see somebody standing at the top. He went up the stairs and nobody was there. And he absolutely swore to me he knew he saw somebody up there. And he said it looked like somebody in an old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's uniform. So as I was, you can see in this picture, this aerial picture, the house off to the right there. And Dennis was in the house looking out the window towards the lighthouse when that happened. So as I was saying, legislation was passed to keep a human presence on the island. The Coast Guard had keepers there for some years after that, but then they felt they had other things for their personnel to be doing. So they hired a civilian keeper about 18 years ago. They hired this woman, Sally Snowman. She is the only official lighthouse keeper in the United States, still employed by the federal government. Her job is more about leading tours and supervising volunteers. The light itself is automated. It's on 24 hours a day. She doesn't have to worry much about that, just call in a technician if something needs to be done. And actually right now the light is off because the chariot wheel assembly that turns that beautiful old lens from 1859, the chariot wheel assembly is malfunctioning and they have to replace some parts. That needs to be fixed. Right now there's an emergency light in use. But anyway, Sally is not doing the traditional job, but it's still an important job. She likes to wear these colonial style dresses that she makes herself when she's out there. She likes to wave a hanky at passing ships, so she really gets into the role. And she's told me some interesting stories. These Coast Guard auxiliary watchstanders, volunteers for the Coast Guard that she supervises, have told her some interesting things. For one thing, a few of them have said that they have seen what they describe as a woman standing at the top of the tower in the evening. I think it's usually around dusk. And they describe her as wearing like nightgown type attire with long flowing hair. I'm not saying they don't see that, but that's kind of a little bit of a cliche kind of ghost, but maybe they've seen that. They also say they've seen a woman walking the trails at night on the island, the paths. And one of the most interesting stories was one of the watchstanders was sleeping on the couch in the living room, and they were checking the cellar periodically because there was a rainstorm going on, and sometimes there was a leak problem in the basement. So they were getting up periodically and checking that. One of the times they got up, there's a stairway going to the second floor right near the couch. And they looked at the stairway, and there was a woman on the stairs, and their eyes met for a few seconds, and suddenly the woman was gone. And this person swore to Sally that that's what they saw. I will tell you that a couple of years ago, I got to spend the night on that couch at the invitation of Sally. And I was very aware of that stairway. But the only thing that really haunted me that night was the sound of the seagulls all night that kept me awake. But it was just a tremendous experience being able to spend a night out there. So I'm going to move along here, and I'm going to jump down to southern New England. This is, I think, one of the most incredible lighthouses architecturally anywhere, built in 1909, New London Ledge Light. It's at the mouth of the Thames River. That is how they pronounce it there, not Thames like in England. The Thames River between New London and Groton, Connecticut. And it's like a mansion there at the mouth of the river. And they say it was built in such a beautiful style to be in keeping with the beautiful homes on shore around the time it was built. And this has probably the most famous lighthouse ghost story of any lighthouse in New England. And it's one of those stories where you have to start by saying they say, because I can't guarantee that this is a true story, the legend that's told to explain the happenings out there. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you the story, again, with no guarantee that it's true. This is the story as it's usually told. They say that in the 1930s, there was a keeper at New London Ledge Light named Ernie. And they say that Ernie was living at the lighthouse with his wife, and his wife became very bored. That is very easy to believe. So his wife became very bored, and Ernie was away from the lighthouse one day, picking up supplies. He was away for a few hours, and he came back, and there was a note from his wife. His wife wasn't there. There was a note she left behind saying that she had run away with the captain of the Block Island ferry. And there's different versions of the story, but most versions say that Ernie became distraught. He went to the roof of the lighthouse and dove off to his death. Some versions of the story said that he drank too much and fell off the roof to his death. Some versions of the story say he left a note behind saying that because of what his wife had done to him, he would curse the place forevermore, that he would haunt the lighthouse. In any case, excuse me, in any case, ever since then, many people have experienced strange things in this lighthouse. There are a number of newspaper articles from the 1970s and 80s about Coast Guard keepers experiencing weird things. For instance, the foghorn, the modern electronic foghorn, would turn on and off for no apparent reason, whether it was sunny or foggy. Of course, they would turn it on manually when it was foggy, but they said it was always malfunctioning. And the light itself would come on and off for no apparent reason. Their TV would turn on and off for no reason, etc. The one article claimed that their furniture rearranged itself. I wasn't there, so I'm not real sure about that. But and other people visiting the lighthouse, had odd experiences. So in more recent years, many of these paranormal investigation groups have been called in to explore this place, to investigate. The TV show Ghost Hunters has been there. Most Haunted, I think that show is still on. I think the Travel Channel, it's a group of English ghost hunters. They've been there. There's actually a segment of that show on YouTube, Most Haunted show, from this lighthouse. And there was a part where one of the guys in the group is whistling a tune in the basement. And seconds after he whistles the tune, it's like you hear a whistle from somewhere else in the building imitating what he did. And they all acted very shocked because supposedly there was nobody else in that part of the lighthouse. The lights turned off suddenly for no apparent reason. So some stuff happened with them. Anyway, I got to go out with the TV show in 2006, July 2006. American Builder was a show for years that was produced by Comcast Cable on their own channel. It was on every day. It was like a home improvement kind of show. And they decided to do a Halloween special about the haunted lighthouse. So I went out there with a group that was, of course, there was a TV crew, but also a group called New England Ghost Project. And in the picture on the left here, first of all, the young guy in the maroon baseball cap was named Jimmy, and I can't remember his last name, but he was one of the hosts of the American Builder show. So he was out there with us. The man with the tan baseball cap, you'll see him better in some other pictures, but that's Ron Kolek. He's from Drake, Mass. And he's a well-known paranormal researcher. He started New England Ghost Project. He's the lead investigator. He's written 3 books on he and Maureen, the woman with the curly blonde hair, have co-written 3 books on the paranormal, and Ron has several radio shows. And the woman with the blonde hair, again, is Maureen Wood, and she is a trance medium, a psychic medium. And the idea is that, you can choose to believe it or not, but the idea is that spirits appear to speak through her. She claims to be 5th generation psychic, and her daughter also seems to have these abilities. Maureen always says, she didn't ask for this, but she just seems to have this ability. And I tend to be skeptical of these things, but I'll tell you that I've been around Maureen several times in investigations, and I've seen her come up with some amazing things. And I'll tell you about a couple of those today. The other woman in the pictures is Karen Mossy, and she was the EVP expert for New England Ghost Project at that time. And I'll explain what that means in a couple of minutes here. So let me go back to this picture for a minute. Early in the evening, they tried using the Ouija board that you see there on the floor. Ron felt that would be something visual for the TV show. He doesn't usually use a Ouija board in investigations. Some people think Ouija boards are evil and dangerous. Ron doesn't think that. He thinks it's just another tool. Excuse me. Excuse me. But anyway, not much happened when they tried using the Ouija board here. Sorry. I think my allergies are bothering me a little bit. Sorry. I think I need to take a drink of my iced coffee here. Pardon me. So anyway, so they tried the Ouija board, not much happened. And then they tried more of like a seance type of thing where people sat in a circle and were holding hands. I was not part of that group. I was standing nearby, and I was near also a room that was like a base camp. They had cameras in the lighthouse and microphones, and the base camp had a couple of TV monitors monitoring those cameras. And in the base camp was Ron Kolek Jr., Ron's son, was watching the screens and everything. So as they're sitting there holding hands, Maureen said, "Oh, there's someone here," meaning a spirit. And it was just when she said that, the monitors in the base camp went to like static and just started making like white noise, and it was weird how it happened just when she said there was a presence there. And then she started speaking like she was a different person. And she had her eyes closed, but she opened her eyes and she looked at Ron. And I swear to you, it wasn't Maureen looking at Ron. It was like it was somebody else was there. And she looked so angry. And she said, "You lie, you lie." And by the way, on the other side, she was holding Jimmy's hand, the guy from American Builder. And he was this big, strong young guy. He said that she's a fairly small woman. He said that she hurt his hand. She was squeezing it so hard. So she said to Ron, "You lie." And then she started moaning like her head hurt. She put her hands on her head and she kind of fell over backwards and she acted like she was in a lot of pain. And Ron tried to bring her out of it. He said, "It's okay, Maureen, it's okay." And after a couple of minutes, she was fine. So she kind of put some things together in her mind from what she experienced there. First of all, she did no homework. She wasn't told anything about the place in advance. She knew nothing about the Ernie story and all that. This is Ron and Maureen early in the morning, where we were waiting for a boat to come and pick us up, take us back to the mainland. It was very foggy out that morning. So Maureen, what she put together is that she felt there was a very angry male spirit there. And she said this guy was not a lighthouse keeper. He was a construction worker, and that he was part of a crew out there doing some kind of work in the lighthouse. She thought maybe even involved in the building of the lighthouse in the first place. And she said the other guys on the crew locked this man out on the roof of the lighthouse as a prank, and that he slipped and fell to his death trying to get back in. Now, is there any proof of any of that? Of course not. There's absolutely no record of anything like that happening. But there's also no record of a lighthouse keeper. There's no record of a lighthouse keeper named Ernie, and there's no record of a lighthouse keeper ever dying out there. So I actually think Maureen's story is more believable than the usual story about Ernie the lighthouse keeper. If a construction worker died out there and his death was covered up, then who knows? But we haven't found any record of anything like that. But again, she feels that he's angry because his death was covered up. Also angry because everybody thinks it was a lighthouse keeper who died, and it wasn't. It was a construction worker. So it's an interesting alternate version of the story. So I mentioned EVPs before. Karen Mossy was the EVP person at that time for New England Ghost Project. Those of you who watch the paranormal shows on TV probably know what EVPs are. It stands for electronic voice phenomena, and it goes back to the early days of sound recording. And the idea is that researchers will use a recording device, these days usually a small digital audio recorder, and they will sometimes let it record for a while, or they might ask questions in the recorder. But the idea is that when the recording is played back, there will sometimes be a voice or voices on the recording that are believed to be spirit voices. And a true EVP is not heard audibly at the time. In other words, if you hear a weird voice in a lighthouse audibly with your ears, that's not an EVP. That's an audible manifestation or whatever. But EVPs are really interesting. There's a lot of theories about them. I don't know the explanation, but I will tell you that I've been around when some really compelling EVPs have been recorded. So Karen got a couple of interesting ones at New London Ledge. Late at night, she was in the lighthouse, and I'm going to play it for you. You're going to hear Karen's voice say, "Are you here? Yes or no?" And it seemed like she got an answer to that.
Are you here? Yes or no?
Some of the other ones I'm going to play are louder than that. I apologize that one's pretty soft, but it certainly sounds like she gets an answer. It sounds like a man's voice saying yes when she says, "Are you here? Yes or no?" So another one she got was recorded out on the deck of the lighthouse at the top of the stairs. I think it was about 2 a.m. And it's kind of a whispery voice. And, EVPs are open to interpretation. It's best to use headphones to listen to them, to hear them really well. And she interpreted this one as saying, "Help me, I'm cold." But again, it's open to some interpretation. I think the second part of it is more clear than the first part. Let me play it for you. The "I'm cold" part to me seems pretty clear. So there are classes of EVP, A, B, C, D, A being, very distinct and you can't mistake what's being said. This one may be a B, I would say. And, the people have experienced things in some cases that they relate to what they say was a sailboat wreck at the lighthouse. So there are other legends there. There's no record of a sailboat wreck, but some people say there was a sailboat was wrecked nearby and a whole family died, and that has something to do with the hauntings. But again, no record of it. And here's Ernie, the ghostly keeper. He's sitting by one of the windows in the lighthouse. And I think at times they point him in different directions. If you're going by in a boat, you might see Ernie the ghost looking out at you, which probably startles some people who don't know anything about it. But the lighthouse is owned now by the New London Maritime Society. They do run tours out there on occasion. Jumping up to Midcoast, Maine. This is, I think, one of the most beautiful light stations in New England, Owl's Head Light near Rockland, Maine. It is now the headquarters of the American Lighthouse Foundation, which I'm very involved with. The Keeper's House there on the left has the offices of the American Lighthouse Foundation, also a museum and gift shop in there. So it's a great place to visit. It's also a state park, a Maine state park. And you can see how there's stairs and first a walkway, like a ramp from the house, and then stairs going up to the lighthouse. It's only a short little, about 25-foot lighthouse, but it's up on this bluff that's about 100 feet high, the entrance to Rockland Harbor. And a lot of the stories at this lighthouse seem to point to the idea that a keeper of the past is still keeping watch there, somebody maybe who died a long time ago. The man on the right is George Woodward. He was a keeper in the 1940s. I'm not saying that he haunts the place. I'm just showing him as an example of a keeper at this lighthouse. And I first heard about the ghost stories at Owl's Head back in the late 80s. And I should mention that in more recent years, this has been called the most haunted lighthouse in America by the Coastal Living magazine. I'm not sure about that, but there's a lot of stories. So I first heard about him in the late 80s, as I said, and the picture on the left there, believe it or not, that's me on the far left in 1989. And with me in that picture with the dark pants and tan shirt is Malcolm Rouse, or Mac Rouse, and he was the last official Coast Guard keeper of this lighthouse. When I was there, it was in the process of being automated. He left a short time after that. So when I talked to him, we talked about a lot of things, but he told me the place was haunted. And he said that his young son repeatedly saw an old woman sitting in a chair in the kitchen when nobody was there. His son insisted on it. He said his wife also had some experiences seeing a figure. And one of the things that Mac told me about is something that I've heard from a few people. It's a fairly well-known story about this place, is that after a snowfall, they would go out early in the morning and see footprints going up the ramp and the stairs to the door of the lighthouse and just ending there. And they didn't come across the yard or anything. They would just start on the walkway and they would end at the door, not go anywhere from there. So that didn't seem to make a lot of logical sense. Before Mac Rouse was there was a guy named John Norton in the early 80s. And I talked to him one time, and he told me that one night he was trying to sleep in the upstairs bedroom. And he told me he knew he was wide awake, that he didn't dream this. And above him in the room, he said he saw the face of an old man looking at him. And he said it was very clear and he had no doubt about it. And then it just faded away. It wasn't there anymore. And he insisted to me he wasn't even close to being asleep or dreaming or anything like that. After him, there was a couple named German, Germann, Andy and Denise German. They had a number of experiences. One of the most interesting was one night they were going to bed. Andy realized he needed to do something outside. He told his wife he'd be right back. He left. So she's lying there in bed. And she said that in the bed next to her, she saw what looked like the indentation of a person moving around in the bed, but nobody was there. So that was a little creepy. And her husband came back and he said that when he left the room, he saw what looked like a gray smoky figure moving from the hallway through the wall, like it was going into the bedroom. And the timing of that seemed to coincide with what his wife experienced. So it was all very interesting. A little bit later, a new family arrived to move into the house. Gerard Graham, you see in this picture on the right, with his wife Debbie and their little daughter Claire. And when they were starting to move in, the Germans told them that the house is haunted. And they said, especially this one upstairs bedroom, they said, you don't want to use that room. Excuse me. The Grahams laughed. They thought that was hilarious. So they made that one room their daughter Claire's bedroom. And for the couple of years they lived there, that was Claire's bedroom. And it turned out that for the entire time they lived there, Claire had a friend. I don't know if you want to call it an imaginary friend or not. Maybe it wasn't imaginary, but she had a friend that she called an old sea captain. And one night, about 11 o'clock at night, Gerard and Debbie Graham were asleep. 3-year-old Claire came into their bedroom, woke them up and said, "Fog's coming in, time to put the horn on." And they had no idea where she got that because they had never talked about anything like that with her. So that was really, really strange. So Debbie emailed me a number of years ago and said, you know, the place is haunted, right? She told me that story. Later, a little bit later, the Travel Channel was making a documentary, Haunted Lighthouses of America. And I recommended they talk to her, and they ended up flying her up from Florida to be in the show. By the way, they're standing by the Fourth Order, which is kind of a relatively small size, Fourth Order Fresnel lens at Owl's Head Light. That lens from the 1800s is still in use there. So this is from the Travel Channel show, which was done about 20 years ago, and they've shown it many, many times. I don't think they've shown it recently, but the Travel Channel showed it many times. Haunted Lighthouses of America. I'm interviewed in it but also I got to play the lighthouse ghost a little bit. That's not me in this picture. At the time the show was made, there was a Coast Guard officer in charge of one of the local Coast Guard buoy tender living there with his wife and family. And his wife, the officer wasn't there when we were there filming, but his wife said that she believed the place was haunted. She said she would sometimes see like what she described as swirling lights in that bedroom upstairs at night. And her father, and it's her father in this picture, they had him wear the old lighthouse keeper's uniform and kind of look like the mysterious keeper walking up the stairs. He said that once he was trying to sleep in the upstairs bedroom and the bed started vibrating like crazy. And he said there wasn't a storm, nothing else was vibrating except his bed. And he laughed. He thought that was really funny. I'm not so sure I laugh quite so much. There's another scene where you see the mysterious keeper looking out to sea at the top of the lighthouse. And that's me from behind with a jacket and hat on, if you ever see it. There's another scene at a lighthouse called Prospect Harbor where you see a shadow moving up the wall, a shadow of the keeper. And that's my shadow, in case you ever see the show. So this picture was sent to me about, I'd say at least 10 years ago now, by a man named Bob D'Amato who lives in Connecticut. And he took this about 11 o'clock at night at Owl's Head, and it was a long exposure. He said it was, I believe, at least several seconds. And he had a tripod set up at the top of the stairs near the lighthouse. And he said the only other person with him was his friend who was behind him when he took this picture. And he noticed when he was looking at his pictures later, there was something odd in it. If you look to the right of the flagpole near that fence, there's something strange. So I zoomed in and cropped it, and this is what is there. Now, I can't explain this. First of all, he said there was nobody there except his friend behind him. If there was another person there who walked through the picture or even was just standing there, it'd be blurry because it was a 5-second or so exposure. It looks really sharp. It looks like a figure standing there. The outlines look sharp, except you can see right through it. So I have no explanation for this other than it's really strange. And your explanation is as good as mine. All right, moving down the coast a bit. This is Seguin Light, which is at the mouth of the Kennebec River. It's in Georgetown, Maine. If you've been to Popham Beach, you look out from there, you can see Seguin quite clearly. It's the only lighthouse in northern New England that still has a first order, meaning the largest size lens that they made, a first order Fresnel lens, about 9 feet tall. It's also the highest light in the state of Maine. The light's about 200 feet above the water. And it has another one of the most famous lighthouse ghost stories of any lighthouse. It's another one of those they say stories, so I can't guarantee it's true, but I'll tell you the basic story. I'll show you an old postcard here from the early 1900s. They say that in the mid 1800s, there was a keeper living here with his wife, and his wife became very bored. Common thread here, and again, not hard to believe. The wife of the keeper asked her husband for a piano to help pass the time. So he bought a piano. He had it delivered by a crew, brought out on a schooner. And this crew, a few guys, carried the piano up the steep path and put it in the keeper's house for the keeper's wife. But along with the piano, she was only given one piece of sheet music. It was a popular song of the day, and she quickly learned how to play that song. But it was the only music she had, the only song that she knew how to play. So she would play it over and over and over and over and over. You get the idea, and over until it drove her husband insane. They say he grabbed an axe they had for chopping firewood, chopped up the piano into kindling, and proceeded to murder his wife and kill himself. So they say. And they say that ever since then, if you're on the island on a quiet day and you listen really carefully, you're going to hear that beautiful piano music, that same song playing over and over again. You'll hear that music kind of drifting in the breeze. Now, this is another case where there's absolutely no record of a murder-suicide there, no record of a keeper dying there on Seguin Island. But many people claim they've heard the piano music. And about, I guess it must be 15 years ago now, I was on a boat, a Coast Guard boat, inspecting some lighthouses that were going to be transferred by the government. And one of the other people on the boat was a woman from the GSA, the General Services Administration in Boston. And she told me that a few days earlier, she had been on Seguin Island. She never heard the ghost story, never heard about the piano and all that. And she said that as she's walking around by herself, she heard beautiful piano music. And she described it as sounding like a memory, which is an interesting way to describe music. She went to the caretaker at the keeper's house and said that was really pretty, who was playing the piano. And he said, there's no piano here. Nobody was playing any music. So you must have heard the ghost. And she insisted to me that she knew what she heard. She definitely heard pretty piano music. They say that lobstermen sometimes passing by in their boats will hear the music drifting from the island and so forth. There's other stories too about Seguin that the keepers would sometimes hear what sounded like a man coughing in the tower when nobody was there. I just did this lecture in person locally a few days ago, and a woman told me afterwards that her son was in the Coast Guard and was stationed at Seguin Island, and she said he was sure the place was haunted. And that they trying to remember what she said exactly, especially when he was going to the fog signal building at night. It was like there was a presence there, and he and the other guys were absolutely sure the place was haunted. So I'm going to move along down the coast a bit more. Goat Island Light is in Kennebunkport. It's actually in the Cape Porpoise section or village of Kennebunkport. Maybe some of you have been to the Cape Pier Chowder House. You drive to the end of the road there where the chowder house is. There's a parking area, and you look out to the left and you see the lighthouse out in the distance about a mile away, or half mile maybe. So it's just another short brick lighthouse, but it goes back to the 1830s. And it's connected to the keeper's house by a covered walkway, as you see there. And this is taken care of by a group called the Kennebunkport Conservation Trust. They take care of a bunch of the islands around there, and they do a great job at the lighthouse. Here's an early 1900s postcard of it. And the man on the upper left is Scott Dombrowski, and I've known him for around 25 years. He is originally from Marblehead, Mass., and he moved to Kennebunkport in the 90s, and he got very involved with the Conservation Trust and with Goat Island Lighthouse. And he and his wife and 2 sons spent a number of summers living out there at the lighthouse. He became the summer caretaker, basically, for the lighthouse. Meanwhile, his friend Dick Curtis on the upper right was also from Marblehead, and he also moved to Kennebunkport, became a lobsterman, and he ended up becoming the winter caretaker for the lighthouse. So he was living out there in winters. In May of 2002, Memorial Day weekend, Dick Curtis was on shore. The harbor master's office is there on shore near the chowder house there. And he was talking to people, and he was saying he was going to go out for a boat ride around sunset. And he had 2 dogs with him. He lived on the island with 2 dogs. He also had, I believe, somebody else's dog. So he had 3 dogs with him. And he went out in his boat, and they realized by the next day he had not returned. So a search party went out. This was all over the news that they were looking for him. And eventually they found his boat overturned on the far side, the ocean side of the lighthouse. And eventually, sadly, they found his body. Nobody's sure exactly what happened, but some people thought that maybe the dogs got in trouble in the water and they were struggling, and he was trying to help them, and he fell out, the boat overturned. It was chilly, the water was cold, he was probably wearing heavy clothing, and so on. But anyway, he didn't make it. By the way, one of the dogs made it back, the other 2 didn't. So they had a big memorial service for him. He was a really popular guy. Not long after that, I was on the island. I was visiting Goat Island. I was with his friend Scott, and we're standing at the top of the lighthouse. And Scott said to me, Dick and I used to joke that after we die, we'll haunt this place. And Scott has had so many experiences out there, and he feels strongly that the presence of his friend Dick is still there. One time a group came out. There was a woman who told Scott that she was a psychic. He didn't know anything about her, but she said she was psychic. And she said, out of the blue, she said, your friend will make himself known by electronic means. And Scott didn't know what that meant. But then he said what would happen commonly is he would be walking near the lighthouse, and the electronic foghorn at the top of the tower at that time was on a sensor, so it was only supposed to go off when it was foggy. But he said it didn't matter if it was sunny or whatever the weather was. He'd be walking near the lighthouse, and the horn would blast, boom, and just once, and he felt that was Dick saying hello to him. And then something really interesting happened in 2006. You may know that Walker's Point, the Bush family estate, is near there in Kennebunkport. And of course, George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, and his wife Barbara spent summers there for many years. In 2006, George W. Bush at the time was president, the son of George H.W. Bush. So during the presidency of George W. Bush, Vladimir Putin came over from Russia, and they had like a little summit meeting at Walker's Point in Kennebunkport. It was obviously big news at the time. And Scott heard through the grapevine that a bunch of them were going to come out in a boat, probably come near Goat Island on this one afternoon. So in preparation, Scott flew a Russian flag next to the American flag on the island. And he was waiting at the top of the lighthouse to see what was going to happen. Boat came out with both father and son Presidents Bush and Putin from Russia and some other Russians and Secret Service and so forth. And they saw the flag and they're waving and smiling. And Scott was standing there by himself next to the foghorn at the top of the lighthouse. And he said out loud, "How do you like that, Dick?" And the second he said that, the horn started blasting. "How do you like that, Dick?" Wah, wah, on a sunny day. And he said it wouldn't stop. It just kept going. And he had to call the Coast Guard out, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. The horn never worked right after that. And eventually they had to replace all the equipment. So anyway, he felt sure that it was Dick approving of what was going on that day. And there you see the little memorial to Dick Curtis on the island there. So I got two more lighthouses I want to tell you about, and I'm going to try to get through them fairly quickly here. White Island Light is not far from, I live here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The Isles of Shoals, as some of you might know, are a group of 9 islands offshore divided between Maine and New Hampshire. White Island is at the southern end of the islands. It's the southernmost island. It's part of the town of Rye, New Hampshire. Celebrating its 200th anniversary this year, the first lighthouse on the island went into service in 1821. And it's probably best known for the fact that this woman, Celia Thaxter, lived there as a girl. She became one of the most famous poets and writers of the late 1800s in New England. Her father, Thomas Layton, was the keeper for about 8 years. And later in her poems, Wreck of the Pocahontas and some of the other poems she wrote, she mentions the lighthouse. And in her book, Among the Isles of Shoals, she talks about growing up there. So that's what it's best known for. She didn't write about ghost stories at White Island, but she did write about some of the ghost stories on the other islands. There's a lot of all kinds of legends and lore on the Isles of Shoals. And the story that's usually told about the islands involves Blackbeard the pirate. It's another they say kind of story, but they say that Blackbeard the pirate spent a lot of time in the Isles of Shoals, that he would come there periodically and bury treasure. They say that this one time he came to the islands with a young bride that he had married at sea, a teenage girl, and he put her ashore on one of the islands along with his treasure, buried his treasure. Different versions of the story have it being different islands, sometimes White Island, where the lighthouse now is, sometimes Star Island, where there's now a conference center, sometimes Lunging Island, which is privately owned. But in any case, they say he left his young bride and his treasure on this island, and that he said he would return, but he was killed off the coast of North Carolina. That part is true, and he never returned. And they say that this young woman died, and her ghost haunts the place, saying, "He shall return, he shall return." Is that true? I'd say probably not, but I will say that many people have experienced, a lot of people say they've seen a ghostly woman in white on the various islands out there. And some have also heard a woman's voice that was hard to explain. This is the last group of Coast Guard keepers that was there in the 80s. The light was automated in 1986. The picture on the right was taken by a man named Glenn Young, who was stationed at White Island in the Coast Guard a little bit before 86, in the earlier 80s. He later became the caretaker at the conference center at Star Island, and he took this picture during a storm of the lighthouse. And that light is 82 feet above the water. So that's a big, big wave there. And that place really takes a beating in storms. But Glenn Young also told me that he would sometimes be walking in that covered walkway between the house and tower during when a storm was coming in. He said whenever there was about to be a storm and he would be in that walkway, he would hear a woman's voice. And he said he couldn't make out the words. It was kind of indistinct, but he said it sounded urgent, like she was warning him. And he said there was no woman on the island, and he knew he wasn't hearing the wind or anything else, that it was very definitely a woman's voice. This is a video clip I'm going to play you from the blizzard of 1978, early February 78. And it was taken by one of the two young Coast Guardsmen who were there at the time. And one of them told the story to a friend, a Coast Guard officer, who told the story to me. And what happened was this young Coast Guardsman knew there was going to be a big storm coming in. He was by the boathouse, which you see in this clip. There's a shed being moved around there by the waves. Behind it is the boathouse. So this young Coast Guardsman was by the boathouse when the storm was coming in, trying to secure things the best he could. And as he was doing that, he said that the apparition of a woman in white appeared to him. And he said she actually spoke to him and said something to the effect of, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." And he was reassured by that. And the damage was not that bad out there, as it turned out. I don't know how reassured I'd be by a ghost talking to me. But anyway, damage was much worse at Boone Island, a little bit up the coast off southern Maine. Two Coast Guard keepers there had to be rescued by helicopter during that storm. So it was worse there. But anyway, that is, one of many stories about White Island Lighthouse. And the bad news about White Island was that it's under state ownership, state of New Hampshire. And for a number of years, they neglected it and the lighthouse was falling apart. But the good news is that the woman in blue there, Sue Reynolds, who was a science teacher at the Northampton School, started a program called the Lighthouse Kids. And each year, 7th graders would get involved. Over the years, over a few years, they raised over $200,000. They got a big federal grant. And in 2005, the Lighthouse Tower was restored. So the Lighthouse Kids did an amazing job there. All right, this is my last lighthouse I want to tell you about. And this is my local lighthouse. It's 10 minutes from my home here. Portsmouth Harbur Lighthouse is in the town of Newcastle, right next to Portsmouth, about a mile in from the mouth of the Piscataqua River, which separates the New Hampshire coast from the Maine coast. And it's basically marking the way into Portsmouth Harbor, which was another very busy port early in our history. So the first lighthouse was built here 250 years ago. The station's celebrating its 250th anniversary this year. It's been rebuilt twice. The cast iron lighthouse that's there now was built in 1878. You see what used to be the keeper's house off on the right there. The Coast Guard, it's on a Coast Guard station now, Coast Guard Station, Portsmouth Harbor. The Coast Guard uses the house for offices today, so there's nobody living there. And you see the granite wall of Fort Constitution there. There's inner walls in the fort that date back to 1808, and then there's the granite 1860s walls. A lot of history on that site. This man, Joshua Card, was the longest serving keeper of the lighthouse, 35 years, 1874 to 1909, local man from Newcastle. And they say that he loved to show people around his lighthouse. He's wearing the old lighthouse service uniform, the civilian uniform in this picture. It had the letter K on the lapels, which stood obviously for keeper. But they say if he was showing people around and they asked him what the K stood for, he would always tell them, "Why, captain, of course." So he told them it stood for captain. And, I think he knew how to spell, but I think he was kind of a wise guy maybe, but he also, I believe, liked to be called captain. So lighthouse keepers were called captain often as a sign of respect. People would have called him Captain Card. He had a stroke at the age of 86. He was the oldest lighthouse keeper in the country at the time. He died a short time later. He's buried just down the road at a cemetery there in Newcastle. So I'm going to come back to him in a minute here, but I needed to tell you that story. And I want to tell you about Elson and Connie Small. They came in 1946. We're only there for a couple of years at the end of a 28-year career at lighthouses. Elson was the keeper, and Connie, even though she wasn't paid to be an assistant or anything, basically was an assistant keeper. Years later, at the age of 85, Connie wrote a wonderful book called The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife, about her life at lighthouses. It's just a great book, and I recommend it really highly. And I was lucky enough to know Connie in her late years. She lived in Portsmouth. In the picture on the right, that's me on the far right with a couple of our board members of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse, Joanne and Paul there. And we're giving a certificate to Connie when she was 101. We called her our honorary chairperson. We called her our guiding light. She was a really happy, optimistic person, and just so happy to know that people were taking care of lighthouses. So I'm going to refer back to Connie in a minute here too, but I wanted to kind of set things up for you. When I first started Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse as a chapter of the American Lighthouse Foundation, It was about 20 years ago, 2001 it was founded. And I started hearing stories right away from the Coast Guard, because again, it's on a Coast Guard station. They're on watch 24 hours much of the year. And I started hearing things like they would see a woman walking on the seawall at night. They'd check it, nobody was there. One of them swore he saw a man standing in front of the keeper's house around midnight, started to say something and walked towards him, and the man disappeared. A woman working on the first floor of the keeper's house told me that she would hear footsteps going back and forth, and she would check and nobody was there, going back and forth above her, and there was nobody there. And they would hear the person on watch in the tower on the main building would hear footsteps coming up the middle stairs at 2 a.m. That happened a lot, and they check, and again, nobody was there. These things were just kind of mounting up. So in 2005, we called in New England Ghost Project to do the first ever investigation there. So there's Ron Kolek and Maureen Wood and Karen Mossy of the group. And they're in the watch room of the lighthouse, which is just below the lantern where the light is. And a number of interesting things happened that night. First of all, Karen Mossy got a really interesting EVP in the watch room. I think it was after midnight. And I'm going to play it for you. You're going to hear Karen's voice first say, "Who's there?" And she gets an answer. So here it is. It was a little soft, but I hope you could hear it. She feels the voice is saying captain, or maybe the captain, really quick. So that's why I told you the story about Joshua Card liking to be called captain. Do we know that that's his voice? Of course not. But I'll tell you that that voice and that clip and a couple more I'm going to play for you sound very similar to a voice I heard audibly one time in the lighthouse one afternoon. I was giving a tour for a young couple. This is about 15 years ago. And as I'm talking to them, I was in the watch room leaning on the ladder that goes up to the lantern room. And I'm talking and I heard, "Hello," just like that. I stopped and I said to them, "Did you hear something?" The man said, "Yeah, I heard a man say hello." His wife didn't hear anything. We checked downstairs. We checked all around the lighthouse. There was nobody around, nobody in sight. My wife has been there alone, taking down Christmas decorations, and she heard a male voice in her ear. She couldn't make it out, but she said it was like he was right there. And she turned around and looked around. There was nobody there. One of our volunteers was up painting one day with headphones on, listening to music by himself. Heard something, so he took the headphones off and he heard, "What are you doing?" And he looked around again, nobody there. So he decided to pack up the paint, go home at that point. And we've also had people say they have seen a figure in an old uniform, a lighthouse keeper's uniform, standing out on the walkway in front of the lighthouse. And these are people who knew nothing about the place before they saw that. So there's a lot of stories. I'm going to play you another EVP here that was recorded about 2 a.m. during a later investigation by Ron Kolek of New England Ghost Project. You're going to hear him say, "Do you like us being here?" And he gets an answer.
"Do you like us being here? Do you like us being here?"
Sure sounds like yes to me. I think that one's pretty clear. And again, it's another similar kind of older, raspy voice. And this is Jim Stonier, who's now the EVP person for New England Ghost Project. And this is right after the one I just played. And both Ron and Jim were out on the deck at the top of the lighthouse about 2 a.m. So here's this one.
"I think you should check the light."
Sure sounds like okay to me.
"I think you should check the light."
Let's play it one more time.
"I think you should check the light."
Ron finds these really interesting because the two are recorded back to back. So he feels that there was a spirit sort of hanging out there for a while. I'm going to play you one more EVP. This is recorded by a different group there called Sauhegan Paranormal in August 2010. We were in the second floor of the keeper's house. You're going to hear a conversation with a couple of women and me. And one of them is talking about a noise she heard, and we're trying to figure it out. I say something like, I scratch my head. Is that what you heard? Right about then, you're going to hear a weird high-pitched voice. So let me play it.
What was that noise?
I heard it.
My camera is closing.
No, it didn't come from your camera.
I scratched my head. You didn't hear that?
No, that's right. It was more like a high-pitched.
So I hope you could hear that. It almost sounds like a cat, but it wasn't. Nothing was heard audibly at the time that was recorded. It was only heard in playback. It really sounds like Mary, Mary, if you listen closely. We're not sure what it means, but there was a daughter of a keeper. Her father Leander White, the keeper, died in the keeper's house. And then his wife later died in the keeper's house, but their son, Henry Cuskley, was married to their daughter, Mary. I don't know if you can follow all that, but some people think that that voice is the voice of Elizabeth White, the keeper's wife, who had died in the house, calling to her daughter, Mary. Do we know that? Of course not. Mary's obviously a common name. But anyway, there's also a lot of stories about Fort Constitution next to the lighthouse. These are the inner walls of the fort. These pictures were taken about 11 o'clock at night, looking out towards the Coast Guard station, nothing going on at all. And they're pretty interesting pictures. I should mention that on the 4th of July, 1809, some soldiers were going to fire a salute for a 4th of July celebration. They put powder out on the ground. It accidentally ignited. There was a huge explosion and 10 people were killed. And that's the worst thing that's ever happened at this fort. And some of the ones who died were children. So it was a terrible event. And some people associate the sort of paranormal type things in the fort with that explosion. So again, your explanation is certainly as good as mine regarding this weird sort of luminous mist you see in the fort entrance in these pictures. And during another investigation by Sauhegan Paranormal, the woman standing in the middle there, that's out on the grounds of the fort, she said out loud, "I feel something touching the back of my neck," which is actually a fairly common thing people have experienced there. Seconds after she said that, somebody snapped this picture, and it looks like a blob of light there with something sticking out of it against her neck. And so it's very interesting, considering the timing of it. And one time I showed this in front of a group, and there was a guy, a paranormal researcher from England, and he got up and looked at it really closely, and he said, "That's a moth." He said a moth flew in front of the camera lens when the picture was taken. And my thought was, well, if that's true, what an amazing coincidence that a moth flew right at that moment, right after she said, "Something's touching the back of my neck," and for the picture to come out like that. So no matter how you look at it, it was really interesting. So one last story here. I mentioned Connie Small before, who lived there for a couple of years. Connie died at 103 in early 2005. And it was only a few months later that we had New England Ghost Project at the lighthouse for an investigation. About 12:30 a.m., a bunch of us were on the second floor of the keeper's house. Maureen Wood, the trance medium, said there's a strong presence here. And right after she said that, she started speaking in a different voice, like she was an old woman. And she kept repeating, "I want to thank you. I want to thank you for the gift." Ron was standing next to her. He said, "Do you want to thank me?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Is it Jeremy?" And she said, "Yes." So I'm standing there and I'm thinking, this sounds like Connie Small, but that's ridiculous. I thought, I felt very skeptical that it's impossible. But I also knew that Maureen didn't know where they were going that night. She knew nothing about the place. So it didn't last very long, this channeling, or whatever you want to call it. After just a couple of minutes, she fell on the floor like a pile of bricks, which she often does. The feeling is that when the spirit leaves her body, there's like nobody in charge briefly. So she just fell on the floor, and they helped her up and she was fine. Everybody else went downstairs. I stayed upstairs for a few more minutes. Then our volunteer, Roxy Zwicker, some of you may know who she is. She's actually written books on the paranormal and gives ghost tours in downtown Portsmouth. So she came back upstairs and she was kind of upset. And she said to me, "You won't believe what Maureen just said to me." Maureen said to Roxy, "Connie wants to thank you for the big pink flowers." Now, at Connie's funeral a few months earlier, it was a small church, open casket in front of the church. I had left the church. Roxy and her husband, Ken, were the last ones out of the church. Roxy had a bouquet of pink tulips. The minister said to her, "If you want to put the flowers in the casket, go ahead and do that." Roxy put the flowers in there, and nobody knew that except Roxy and her husband and the minister. A few months later, Maureen Wood, who had never heard of Connie Small, never met any of us before, out of the blue said to Roxy, "Connie wants to thank you for the big pink flowers." So I'll tell you, I still think it's healthy to be skeptical, but I certainly left that night with a more open mind than I had before. So I want to mention again my podcast that I do for the U.S. Lighthouse Society, Lighthearted, as in people who have lighthouses in their hearts. We have a podcast app on a smartphone. You can find it easily with a search, or you can go to news.uslhs.org to listen. And I just interviewed Ron Kolek for like an hour about the lighthouse investigations we've done together. That'll be released on Halloween on October 31st. So you want to listen for that. And I just put out a new 250th anniversary edition of the History of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse. It's a short book, about 70 pages, and that is available through our website at portsmouthharborlighthouse.org. And my own website is newenglandlighthouses.net, and so on. And you might want to check out New England Ghost Project as well. Ron Kolek and company do a lot of events this month, of course. So I'm going to come out of screen sharing. And I see it's 11:15, so I think we probably need to wind things down fairly quickly here, but.
Jeremy, we can take 5 to 10 minutes of questions. And I just want to say that it's so fun to hear you mention some of the folks you mentioned, like Roxy Zwicker and Maureen Wood and Ron Kolek, because we've hosted them all here at the library. So that's great to hear.
Yeah.
So if you want to read, we have 2 questions in the Q&A and a comment or 2 in the chat. And folks, there's a lot of you still on the line. Feel free to type your questions and comments in, and we'll do a speed round here, Jeremy. Okay.
Okay. I'm looking at the Q&A. I don't really see a question. I say Boston Lighthouse drowning. Did people not know how to swim? Well, first of all, it was November when that happened, so I'm sure the water was extremely cold in Boston Harbor. But I've over the years I've heard about a lot of lighthouse keepers and family members at these lighthouses who didn't know how to swim. It wasn't necessarily something they learned. They were, a lot of fishermen didn't really know how to swim. Which seems kind of strange to us, but that was often the case. But I just think the water was super cold and they probably struggled and just couldn't make it.
All right. Mark says, thank you. Nancy says, please repeat slowly the last 2 links that Jeremy stated. Thank you. Very interesting. Your 2 websites, Jeremy?
Let me briefly go back into screen sharing and bring up that screen. New England Ghost anyway, these speak for themselves. The U.S. Lighthouse Society, uslhs.org, contains the podcast within it, but there's a lot of material on the U.S. Lighthouse Society website. And Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse, we sell the history book I mentioned, and our events are on there. Our tours for the season are over for the season. We just did limited tours by appointment this year. We used to do haunted tours occasionally. Ron Kolek and I would lead haunted tours at night. We haven't done those for the past 2 years for obvious reasons, but we might do them again at some point. So anyway, I hope you're able to get all those.
Yeah, it's possible that some viewers may be on their phones or something, so it's difficult to
Sure.
read. But,
I know I didn't have it up for very long.
Yeah, no, I wrote a few of them in the chat. Cheryl says, fascinating. Thank you. I love lighthouses. Elena says, thank you for an informative and entertaining presentation. Well worth attending at 7 a.m. my time. Thank you, Elena, for waking up early for us, or maybe that's normal time for you. I'm not sure. 7 o'clock is early for me, though. Deborah says, thank you so much for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. Gail said, great talk. She suggested that you don't speak over your recordings. And I'll say, Jeremy, I actually I heard your EVPs better than I've heard any other presenter's EVPs so far this session. So I thought you did a good job there, but thanks for the feedback, Gail. Always appreciate it. Cheryl says that she loves these scary virtual programs. And let's see, last call for questions, folks. Thank you. I agree with Robert about EVPs. Yeah, I couldn't even hear, if I'm being honest, I couldn't even hear a bunch of Tim's EVPs last night. All right, so why don't we wrap it there, Jeremy? Jeremy, do you have any last words for the group before we end the call?
Just happy Halloween. Enjoy the beautiful weather today. And
yes,
thank you all for being here.
You too, Jeremy. Thank you all so much. So look for an email from me later today with a feedback survey and a link to the recording. And I hope to see many of you at some of our future upcoming paranormal programs, including next Saturday morning for Ghosts and Ghouls of Ireland. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm sure we'll do it again in a couple of years.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, everyone.
All right, bye-bye. Have a good one.